Language is the basis for nearly every single apologetics argument out there. See, if you can make words say whatever it is you wish them to say in a specific context, regardless of common usage, it means that you can single-handedly bulldoze the conversation. In short, they who control the words controls the debate. It's part and parcel of sophistry, as we're about to see.
Okay, don't let the title fool you, because I'm probably not going to say anything that nobody really disagrees with. Yes, miracles are impossible. And as long as you're defining impossible and miracles the right way, then nobody disagrees with this statement. Miracles kind of have to be impossible. That's kind of the definition of it. And that's the point. I find it interesting that critics continuously repeat the concept that science has disproved miracles, that miracles have been deemed impossible.
Well, could that have anything to do with the law of non-contradiction? I.e., the statements that A is B and that A is not B are mutually exclusive and cannot both be true. And yet here you are, defending a deity of so-called miracles, magical events either in past or present as having or still occurred, whilst also declaring them to be impossible. If X has occurred, then by very definition, X must be possible. Therefore, X could not logically be classed as impossible at the same time. It could be classed as highly unlikely, out of our ability, improbable, reliant on such seemingly impossible conditions that we had previously thought of said thing as impossible, but none of that is actual impossibility. It's like when creationists claim that a self-forming universe is impossible. We can instantly discard of that pure assertion, as so far all we observe is a universe with entirely naturalistic processes surrounding it. Therefore, a self-forming universe certainly appears to be possible irrespective of religious denial. People are just following the laws of logic when they call you out on that.
It doesn't take a 21st century scientist to tell you that miracles are impossible. I mean, put yourself in the position of somebody who's actually seeing a miracle happen, assuming that it actually did happen. You don't watch a miracle and think, oh yeah, that happens all the time. No, you think, wow, that can't possibly happen, that's not possible. Who am I dealing with here?
And there you have it. The phrase, happens all the time, sort of gave away your gig. You simply conflated improbable with impossible, two words not sharing of the same meaning. Returning to your hypothetical, I would think I have no idea how that occurred, and that's got to be highly unlikely as I've never heard of it before, but I would not think that's impossible. That is except to acknowledge the fact that there's a possibility of psychological malfunction, in which case there's still an explanation as to what I saw, as well as why nobody else witnessed said thing. But that's why we have epistemologies such as evidentialism, to ensure we're not merely tripping on acid.
Arguments like these come up a lot, where critics say things about religion, but if the opposite were true, then it wouldn't do anything to extend the position either. What I mean by that is, let's say that science didn't prove miracles impossible. Let's say that we decided that miracles were possible. We have to change the definitions to do that, but whatever. If miracles were found to be possible, then critics would still be critics, and they would still stand on the outside of religion to think there's a rational explanation for that. Well, rational according to their own worldview.
I consider a position that is demonstrable to be rational. Yes. If you take issue with that, then I would consider your own position to be entirely irrational. Thing is, you're stuck. Christians can't define miracles as being possible. Why? Because if miracles are simply mundane elements of the universe, they become measurable by science, and if they become measurable by science, you lose that age-old excuse of, well, science doesn't touch on the question of God, when it comes to explaining away the total absence of evidence in support of their existence. This is rather odd, as the very same Christians will set out to do everything they can to falsify every scientific model we have so that they can shoehorn God in as the answer. But the moment you ask them why science hasn't actually demonstrated God's existence in a clear and concise fashion, suddenly said God becomes exempt from scientific scrutiny. It's a way to have your cake and eat it, taking us back round to the law of non-contradiction at the start.
Another thing that I should explain. Religious and non-religious people play by different rules of logic. Later I'm going to do a video about how logic doesn't mean truth and how logic means different things based on what worldview that you're coming from, and it's just consistency. I'll get to that later. But the point is that miracles being impossible means different things for the different worldviews. So if you're coming from the critic side, then you think miracles are impossible, so they didn't happen. If you're coming from the religious side, you're thinking miracles have to be impossible, and that's what makes it so amazing.
Well then, it would appear that the Christian population is in dire need of dictionaries to explain what the word impossible actually means, as you yourself have demonstrated a total lack of comprehension of said term. Now, somebody actually queried you about this in the comments section of your video, and you had this to say following their question. I quote, "Hey, Akape, thanks for commenting. I entirely expect naturalists to get frustrated with this argument, but what I like most about it is that it's entirely consistent with the Christian worldview. Impossible might imply that it didn't happen, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean that, at least if we're going strictly off definitions. We believe in the impossible, right? Its inherent nature of being impossible is what makes it incredible. I think we should embrace it, despite how much it might bug another worldview. Along with, if an atheist ever raised such a problem, I would probably explain it exactly how you just did in clarifying the different implications of the word depending on the worldview. Moving past the semantic ambiguity and getting down to the raw characterization of the position is a brilliant move. I think any reasonably minded atheist can get on board with that explanation. The thing is, all you are doing is playing a semantic game to waste time. In the English language, the term impossible is not ambiguous at all, and we already have a term for the very thing you are trying to paint impossible as being, i.e., as noted before, improbable. To me, this seems a cheap way to forward that with no evidence of ever occurring as something that was just unlikely, hoping to rely on a subconscious bias in that person you are talking to in order to give your position an appearance of having more legitimacy than it actually does. So, no, I'm not on board with your active promotion of obscurantism.
I'm going to keep pushing this concept because nobody seems to be doing it and it's super important. Here's the video that I did on postulate. Go watch it if you haven't already. If you postulate the Christian worldview, you'll find that Christians also don't believe that miracles are possible, but they believe that they happen. Because if you're postulating the existence of an all-powerful God that is all-sovereign over the laws of physics and nature, then you can recognize that he has the ability to manipulate those things. And that's still logical according to the Christian worldview. Alright, if you're a critic watching this video, then I want you to know that I'm not trying to be hostile or call you dumb or anything, but this argument that science proves miracles to be possible, you're not telling us anything that we don't already know. You're not convincing us of anything that we're not already agreeing with you on. Miracles, by their very nature, have to be impossible in order to support what we believe. Again, this isn't me trying to be insulting. Like, I want debate to happen, I want you folks to argue with me, and I think it's important that you disagree with me on a lot of things. But if we're gonna have productive conversation, the way to go about it is not making this argument.
Well, I would say it's more important not to deliberately throw out semantic plays designed to stifle the very conversation you claim to want. Yes, different words can have different meanings in different contexts, and yet that has not been the case for Christianity and miracles. As noted earlier, this is a method of equivocation designed to allow the theist to assert that there's scientific evidence for God, whilst retreating when people ask for said scientific evidence. The enemy advances, we retreat. The enemy camps, we harass. The enemy tires, we attack. The enemy retreats, we pursue. Sophistry is the guerrilla warfare of discussion. When you can't win on the basis of the weight of your evidence behind your points, you instead are forced to rely on underhanded methods to secure what appears to be a victory, but to those with a trained eye is merely a fallacious running of one's mouth. That's why in our first conversation you spent so long wasting time over the interpretations that I just got bored and decided to target your set pieces like this with reference reviews. As noted, if miracles are possible, then your God is measurable. And if they're measurable, then the question becomes, why is there no scientific evidence for their existence? But it gets worse. You see, if a force can obliterate the stable laws of the universe, even for a second, then how can you claim to know anything? You see, the moment you claim God transcends reality, your beliefs become indistinguishable to my earlier example of psychological malfunction. God could change the key historical events you'd spent your life learning about, making you wrong when you had previously been correct. So how can you claim to know anything in light of that fact? You see, knowledge cannot exist alongside the God you describe. But moving on, how about we see what you have to say on the moral argument for God?
Let's make one thing clear. I absolutely love the moral argument, and I think that understanding the moral argument is incredibly essential for understanding how other worldviews believe what they believe and what their system of morality entails. Every worldview says something about how we should act, things we should do in the world, and those are important to understand why they say those things and why they say what they do.
So do tell me, what does a pure or uber nihilist say about the way we should act or what we should do? I thought the whole point to them was a refusal to do either of these things. And if not, is it really nihilism? Just something to ponder over.
So in this video, what I'm definitely not saying is ignore the moral argument altogether. Before I get into this video, I need to explain two categories that people say about morality. Or really, what I mean when I say these words. Okay, when I use the term objective, I'm not talking about true right now. When I use the term objective, I mean absolutely true, despite human opinion, despite human action, or human misinterpretation. Now, when I use the term subjective, what I basically mean is everything else. Subjective means constructed and carried out by human beings. And that's whether it's individual or as a society.
Except you're already partaking in a false dichotomy that assumes without basis that no morality, which is human in origin, can be objective. You need to demonstrate how morality from God can be objective, whilst morality from people cannot. Now, values and morals are different. Values are what a person holds, and morals are what said values then entail. Values are subjective, regardless of whether a person is a theist or an atheist. For example, you would say that you value divine authority, whilst I would say that I value human well-being. Your source doesn't make your stance on morality any more objective than mine because ultimately it comes from your personal values. Yet from my value of human well-being, upholding human rights is moral regardless of the situation we are in, and thus meets your definition of objective morality while still being human-sourced, since said human rights we recognise in contemporary society are entirely secular in origin. Now, I know what you may say and respond with. You'll likely say that you covered this with your regardless of opinion disclaimer. However, that is entirely short-sighted. The reason I say this is a euphoria dilemma, i.e., is God good because we define goodness by God, in which case good is merely God's personal opinion, or is God good because there's a greater force of good which defines God, in which case why is God necessary? You see, either God is guilty of moralizing by opinion and thus your special pleading of objectivity just goes out the window, or God is unnecessary for morality, in which case Occam's razor removes them as an element. So why don't you stick to religious versus secular morality? Well, it all comes back to word games. The word objective is waved around like a little flag as we as human beings inherently associate it with other terms such as fair and just, and therefore it acts in both adding perceived value to said morality whilst poisoning the well for alternatives. If we stuck with religious versus secular morality, the argument wouldn't fallaciously hold as much ground as it had done in presupposing one morality as inherently superior than the other, before the discussion had even begun. That's why.
A lot of secularists will tell you that this is the only thing that exists, that actual objective morality does not exist.
Well, I don't know where you'd find me on that scale, as I believe subjective values exist, they're demonstrable, I've done that here. But those values must logically lead to an objective optimum of sorts. Perhaps we should call this the position of detailed nuance that doesn't simply attempt to dichotomize the world into two highly reductionist perspectives to try and make for an easy opponent. Personally, I care very little about what you want to call your morality or my morality, and more about what it says and how that relates to your scripture.
Okay, now there are two basic ways that the moral argument can be used. The first way is basically a line of logic that says if objective morality exists, then there must be a God that enforces and carries out that objective morality. Or in other words, if there is a law, then there must be a lawgiver. There must be somebody that judges according to that law. And the problem with that is nobody buys that method anymore. That is, if we assume that such a moral standard actually has a purpose. Personally, I like this method better, but nobody accepts the premise of objective morality anymore. People are much more accepting of the concept of subjective morality. And the problem there is that if they don't accept the premise of objective morality, then this argument is basically useless, because you need them to accept that there is a law in order to connect it to a lawgiver.
Or, as I've just done, they simply point out that by switching out one set of subjective values for another set of subjective values and calling one subjective and the other objective, whilst declaring them to be fundamentally different solely on the basis of authority, doesn't work as an argument. To see that, you merely have to replace your divine authority with any other dictatorship throughout history, as they made the exact same appeal. Unless you can successfully differentiate yourself from them, your special pleading is revealed.
The second method. Basically, subjective morality sucks and objective morality is better and preferable in terms of function usually. And Christianity provides that. I don't like this method for a lot of reasons. In the eyes of an atheist, usually this comes out as, you just don't have morality. The point of the argument isn't to insult people, though almost inherently that is what it seems to do. This method is basically evaluating the difference between the two and which of them is better.
And of course, we all know what happens when an atheist confronts you over the supposed objective morality of the Bible, which, reminder, you view as objective regardless of time period or social context, in how you attempt to do everything in your power to shut down said conversation. When your morality not only allows for, but advocates, genocide, mass rape, and slavery, as the Bible does, moral analysis is the very last thing you want to do.
One of the bigger reasons that I don't like this method is because it's not an argument about truth. It doesn't stand for anything. It's more of an argument about this is better, so you should accept that. But when you say something is preferable, it doesn't mean that it's true. So even if people are convinced of this method of the argument, that their belief isn't genuine. And I sincerely believe that anybody who believes should actually believe. Again, I love the moral argument, and I think it's absolutely essential for people to learn. But I don't think that it's a good argument to use, especially if the person you're talking to is accepting of the idea of subjective morality. And even if you are talking to somebody that is accepting of the idea of objective morality, it still may not be convincing anyways. When you talk about morality and use it as a basis for criticism, you start to bring into question the person that you're talking to. You're essentially criticizing that person's morality. And even though it's not quite ad hominem, it's still not a good way of arguing. Arguments don't tend to go well when you're insulting the person that you're talking to. And that's whether or not you mean to. Finally, okay, this isn't a reason to ignore the studies of morality and ethics altogether. It is super, super interesting and is absolutely important to learn. But be more mindful about how you bring it up in conversations with people that disagree with you. To other people, it's really just an idea that's being tossed around. Even if they don't get angry and it actually makes logical sense to them, they still may not buy into it. It's a bit of a risk using the argument.
Meanwhile, I find arguing over morality to be an incredibly effective tool as a humanist. I don't believe in avoiding certain topics of discussion because it makes people feel hostile. Nearly every Christian I've ever seen reacts that way regardless of the topic being discussed. You see, many Christians only say they're Christian and go to church because they were raised to say, I'm Christian because Christians are good people, in the name of an all-just God. So when I start to peel away that mantra, the mantra they've been raised with, brought up into, all their life, and I get them to look at the atrocities housed in their scriptures, very often that'll get them to reassess their reasons for believing. And if they were honest in their convictions, they'd do one or two things. They'd either present evidence for God's existence outside of the moral argument, or they'll realize they have no evidence. And to date, I've never seen a case of the former. The best I've seen are ad hoc gobbets designed to prolong the terminal breath of a person's religious beliefs as they enter the denial stage of deconversion. The moral argument isn't good because of any actual consequences. It's good because most people have a sense of empathy and justice. So when you bring up genocide, mass rape and slavery, all forwarded in the Bible, it becomes an issue that creates doubt. And as we all know, doubt is where lies start to perish. So moving on, we now have your video discussing the topics of logic and science.
Science and logic, the battle cry of religious critics. Okay, look, science and logic are very, 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 very good things, and they're even better together, but ultimately they're incapable of determining truth comprehensively. If we're being honest, they're incapable of determining truth beyond what we can see, and even what we can see may not be enough information at all.
Incorrect. They simply can't measure anything which has no measurable effect on our universe. Your statement seems to be a poor rehash of the ever-popular atheists can't see air and yet they believe in it. We can measure something without being reliant on sight. What's more is that we can create instruments to extend our capabilities when it comes to measurements. Yet oddly, we can't seem to measure God. It's like they have no measurable effect on reality if they do indeed exist. As for determining truth comprehensively, what other method do you propose? Science and logic, based on reasoning, are the most effective methods for exploring the universe we live in. It's true, they're not infallible, but nobody who understands science ever claimed otherwise. But just because something isn't 100% effective doesn't then mean you can simply replace it with whatever you want. Chemotherapy isn't 100% effective. That doesn't mean you get to substitute it for homeopathy. Seatbelts aren't 100% effective. That doesn't mean you get to replace it by blessing a car. Therefore, I'm trying to figure out your angle here, as I've heard this many times from apologists who have the end game of downplaying science or casting doubt so they can attempt to force their God in and ignore demands for scientific evidence of said God. Because as mentioned at the start, science investigates anything that has a measurable effect on the universe, which, if your God interacts with, includes said God.
In the 2nd century AD, Claudius Ptolemy created the geocentric model, which is the model that says that the universe, all of the stars, the suns, the planets, revolve around Earth. Okay, some modern critics might suggest that the theory was based on some kind of egotistical, self-centered attitude that we took toward science as human beings.
Actually, it was the hypothesis forwarded by the principle of common sense, which is still upheld as a method by creationism today. However, the model was established in no small part thanks to the power of the dawning Catholic Church, which rose to power rapidly in the 4th century Common Era. This allowed it to suppress conflicting ideas such as heliocentrism, which had been presented by at least the 3rd century Common Era. This was done due to the biblical passages that claimed an unmoving earth, such as 1 Chronicles chapter 16 verse 30, which reads, and I do quote, "Tremble before him, all the earth. The world is firmly established. It cannot be moved." Then we have Psalm chapter 93 verse 1. "The Lord reigns. He is robed in majesty. The Lord is robed in majesty and armed with strength. Indeed, the world is established, firm and secure." A sentiment repeated in chapter 96, verse 10 with, "Say among the nations, the Lord reigns. The world is firmly established. It cannot be moved. He will judge the peoples with equity." And chapter 104, verse 5, "He set the earth on its foundations. It can never be moved." And then, of course, we have both the sun and the moon stopping in Joshua chapter 10, verses 12 through 13. "On the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, 'Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Ajion.' So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, till the nation avenged itself on its enemies, as it is written in the book of Jasher. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down about a full day." So as we can see, the Bible had a large part to play in standing in the way of scientific progress. Once again. But like with many things, the Bible began to lose ground with the dawning of the Renaissance era and the collapse of the Catholic Church's monopoly in Central Europe, and that in turn gave way to the Enlightenment. That's the one good thing Protestantism has ever done for us: fragment Christianity in certain parts of the world to allow secular thought more wiggle room so it could grow.
But it's not like the theory wasn't scientifically verifiable. The position of stars and planets were predictable down to the T, and they were able to predict eclipses of all kinds, and what dates they would happen and when, really, really accurately, and that's all based on the geocentric model.
No, that was done in spite of the geocentric model. sailors had been using the celestial navigation for centuries prior to the geocentric model, as seen by its usage in the Odyssey, where Calypso tells Odysseus to keep the Ursa Major, aka the Bear constellation, on his left. As for the moon, I don't know if you knew this, but said satellite does revolve around the Earth, so there's nothing mystical in the prediction of either lunar or solar eclipses. Again, sailors had been monitoring the lunar eclipses since the dawning of sailing, as a lunar eclipse, aka new moon, results in the spring tide. As for the planets, Uranus wasn't discovered until the 18th century and Neptune until the 19th century. So how you believe geocentrism predicted their movements down to a T escapes me completely. It's true, the consensus at the time was wrong, in no small part thanks to the church, but also a lack of scientific institution. You see, I wonder, how old do you think modern science is exactly? When we talk about modern science, we are talking about peer review, demonstration, testing, the likes of which did not occur back then. Isolated people, relatively speaking, looked at fragments of the natural world, unlike today where they have to account for all of the data available. It's not just the consensus which has changed, but the very methodology of science itself. What you're discussing can only be labelled science in the sense that it attempted to explain the natural world, not that it is like anything we use in science today.
This theory was accepted for almost 1500 years because of how scientifically solid that it was. And critics will rightfully tell you that religion got in the way of converting to the heliocentric model, and yeah, that's true, but that's not the point.
Actually, it kinda is. Science in those days was a brutal process, not only due to the lack of connectivity and the lack of instruments, but also due to the possibility of the church taking offense at your work. You risked a lot in questioning the church's messages, sometimes your own freedom or life. It's no mystery that science only began to develop to become the institution we recognize today during the Enlightenment. When religion infects science, the pool of knowledge stagnates.
The point is that science and logic were perfectly exercised in the geocentric model, and it wasn't adequate in determining what was truth.
Question time. Does science uphold the geocentric model today? The point of my question is that science is a method, not a claim. It's not a divine text, it makes no pretenses to be such, so can't be treated as such. You can't take a snapshot of what early investigation of the natural world got wrong and say, see, this is what science led to. The reality is, that's what science led us away from and towards where we are today. Science evolves, and I don't know if we'll ever reach a point where no more can be learnt about the universe, but what I do know is that no method compares.
Especially when science has a tendency to deny or be critical of everything that we can't actually see or observe, there's a serious problem there. Because there's no way of measuring how much we don't know yet, or how much that we haven't discovered, because it hasn't happened yet. And there's so much that we don't understand that we acknowledge that we don't understand.
That's why you're free to keep investigating, but until you have actual evidence, there is no reason at all to accept your assertions as having any sort of basis beyond your word of mouth alone. It's not a danger to demand evidence for your claims, as shown through the way science discovered protons, neutrons, and electrons. We see it in how DNA was demonstrated to exist. It is shown to us in the discovery of both Uranus and Neptune. Which, if this was your point, I don't know why you didn't go with any of these examples rather than the geocentric model. But the fact is, as demonstrated through Russell's celestial teapot, you need to prove your God in order for science to take you seriously. You can't shirk the burden of proof on the basis of ignorance because we can possibly find evidence for God in the future. I couldn't put you in prison for the possibility that you'll become simply another religious child rapist. So if it's not good enough for the law, then why should it be good enough for science?
Alright, now on logic. A lot of people get this mixed up, but logic doesn't mean true. Oftentimes we use logic to determine what is true, but there, a select few times that things that are illogical are actually true. Logic is a systematic form of reasoning that allows us to evaluate the validity of certain premises to conclusion. And this can be approached with a variety of different methods. Logic is sort of like math for ideas. But the problem is that not all of the ideas exist yet.
Great. So what? That doesn't degrade science, as science will investigate those claims when they're brought forward, just as it did with your God, only to find said claim to be completely wanting of all evidence. What-ifs are fun to play when you're a child and bringing up the crab pots on the possibility that you might have caught a lobster. But in debate, they just show your position to be completely void of actual evidence.
There's so much that we don't know that it's hard to determine really confidently that we know what the truth is, in any way, shape, or form, just based on science and logic.
What total bollocks. There are a lot of things science has shown us with a reasonable degree of certainty, so in total contradiction of what you have just asserted. Now, yes, there's always hypotheticals, such as the universe was formed 5 minutes ago and only looks like it's old or whatever. But these claims are so improbable that they barely factor into the logical equation at all. We can have 99.99 continuum % certainty on such things as the occurrence of evolution, regardless of the possibility that magic may exist. Your partner may in fact be Hitler back from the dead and post-plastic surgery. So can you be reasonably sure that they're not? Yes, you can. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
And again, I'm not saying that science and logic are bad things, or they're things that we should ignore. We should definitely use these things. But ultimately, they're inadequate in determining what is true. You can't determine truth with just science and logic. There's some things that you can, but ultimately it's not good enough to deny certain things as untrue. The method of excluding yourself to just these two ideas is not really good enough, and that's why I stress the importance so much of the postulate video that I did. The idea of postulating things that may or may not be true, but we can theoretically test the ideas of these things.
Right. But if you claim your deity to be a force which has a measurable effect on the universe, then that God is measurable by science, or at least would be if your claims had any sort of merit. Also, science does incorporate postulation at the stage of hypothesis formation in asking, if X were true, what would I expect to observe in my data, and how would that falsify the null hypothesis? So I think you need to study the scientific method, as it's glaringly obvious that you haven't from both this and your usage of non-peer-reviewed blog posts in the previous videos. But more importantly, postulation can only tell us what to look for, not what's there. As for the rest of this video, once again you simply messed around with the definitions of impossible and morality. Originally I wasn't going to respond to your video on the moral argument, but when I decided to check it, just to be on the safe side, I saw you attempt some things that needed to be tackled, including shifting the blame to the atheist for not playing ball when really it's just a terrible argument all round. You can't simply brush aside Christian failures as simply coming down to interpretation. There are actual reasons, genuine reasons, as to why they fail, and I believe my viewers should understand them, not some vague quibble or whatever. The problem for you is that your religion hasn't kept up with the advancements of either science or philosophy, not to mention that these things are becoming more accessible to all thanks to the advancements in education, meaning that the old sophistry you are still reliant on has lost its charm. You're nothing new. You're simply the same old thing pretending that it's not, and it's not that impressive. I guess apologetics is having a midlife crisis. Hi there, I'd just like to say a few things here at the end of the video. First, I'd like to say thank you to everyone who has ever donated to the channel via Patreon, giving a special thanks to the following people: Trevor Matheson, Andrew Spritzer, Sean Conley, Alexander Williams, Daniel Martinez, and of course, Matthew Kovac. Your support has ensured this channel its ability to grow over the years, and hopefully for the years to come. I'd also like to ask that you comment down below and like this video, as well as subscribe and follow Essence of Thought on Facebook. Please also consider following the Atheist Alliance International group on Facebook, an organisation dedicated to helping atheists around the globe. Last of all, I'd like to request that you treat the people responded to in this video with a reasonable degree of respect. Whilst it is understandable that there are justifiable limits to said respect when tackling certain heavy topics, and anger can be a very genuine emotion in tackling injustice, any comments utilising language which insults others on the basis of perceived gender, sexuality, ethnicity, or both ability, mental and physical, will be removed immediately, and the commenter may be blocked on the moderator's discretion. Let's keep this space one which upholds the humanist values. So with that noted, take care.